Welcome to Finish the Race Documentaries. Stories of perseverance and triumph. Real people, real struggles, unstoppable faith. On today's Finish the Race, Clarence Thomas, from poverty to the Supreme Court. Long before he wore a judge's robe or sat beneath the great marble dome of the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas was a barefoot child of the Georgia coast. A boy born into poverty, silence, and segregation. He was born in Pinpoint, Georgia in 1948, a place so small it hardly appeared on a map. The houses were wooden shacks on stilts, the roads unpaved, and the air thick with salt and mosquitoes. The people spoke Gula, a language of their Western African ancestors, a tongue rich in heritage, but poor in opportunity. Clarence Thomas entered the world into the kind of poverty most Americans only read about. His father had abandoned the family when Clarence was 2. His mother, Leola, worked as a domestic servant, often unable to make ends meet. And when their home burned to the ground, Leola made a heart-rending choice. She sent Clarence and his brother to live with her father, Myers Anderson, in Savannah. Myers Anderson was a stern man, uneducated but unyielding. A small business owner who delivered fuel oil and coal throughout Savannah's working-class neighborhoods. He believed in God, discipline, and self-reliance. Every morning he woke before sunrise and expected his grandsons to do the same. His favorite saying would burn into Clarence's memory. Never let the sun catch you in bed. Under his roof, laziness was sin, discipline was gospel. The old man's rough hands and gravel voice taught the boy something no school ever could. Dignity comes from duty. Clarence attended St. Benedict the Moor Catholic school, was run by Irish nuns whose habits were as stiff as the rules. They demanded excellence, order, and virtue from their black students. And in the segregated South, they defied social expectations by believing those children could excel too. Young Clarence thrived under their structure. He memorized catechisms, prayed the rosary, and served as an altar boy. He felt called to the priesthood, to serve God and to lift his people through faith. For a time, his world was faith and study. But outside those church walls, America was on fire. The civil rights movement rising, the nation wrestling with its very soul. Clarence walked to school past segregated water fountains, sat at the back of buses, and heard his grandfather's warning. The world doesn't owe you a thing, boy. You'll earn every inch. He worked after class hauling coal and stacking firewood, and at night he studied scripture by lamplight. His faith grew deep, but so did his awareness of injustice. When he told his grandfather he wanted to be a priest, Myers Anderson hesitated, not from doubt in God, but from fear of a racist world. Still, he agreed and paid for the seminary tuition out of his meager savings It was a sacrifice born of love and discipline. At 17 years of age, Clarence entered the seminary. It was the first step toward a life he believed God had ordained. But the path would soon be tested by a moment that would shake his faith in both man and institution. For now, the boy from Pinpoint was becoming a young man with purpose. His roots deep in faith, his resolve forged in poverty and discipline. And although he couldn't see it yet, every lesson from his grandfather and every hymn from those nuns were preparing him for the storms to come. The race had begun, and every runner must first learn to endure the starting line. The seminary in Missouri promised quiet devotion and higher learning. Clarence Thomas arrived in 1965, a determined young man in a pressed black suit, clutching a Bible worn at the edges. He believed that behind those cloistered walls, he could escape the noise of racism and the poverty of his past. But the world outside would not stay silent. America was convulsing. Selma, Birmingham, Watts, the struggle for civil rights unfolding in blood and fire. Inside the seminary, he studied Latin liturgy and philosophy. Yet something darker stirred within him: isolation. There were few black students, fewer mentors, and even fewer who understood the pressure of being the first. Then came April 4th, 1968. News spread throughout the halls. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated, and Clarence froze in disbelief. And across for the dorm or corridor, he heard laughter. A seminarian celebrating the death of a man who had preached peace. No one corrected him. No priest spoke up. The silence thundered louder than the bells that rang for evening prayer. That night, Clarence packed up his few belongings. He left the seminary before dawn, walking down the steps that once symbolized calling, now marked by delusionment. He would later write, "I left the seminary not because I had lost faith in God, but because I could no longer find him in those who claimed to serve him." Back in Savannah, his grandfather greeted him not with comfort, but with condemnation. "You quit?" Myers Anderson barked. "Then you don't live here no more." Just like that, Clarence was homeless. For months he drifted, angry at the church, angry at his grandfather and America itself. He sought meaning in the civil rights marches, the fiery rhetoric of Black Power, the writings of Malcolm X. Yet even there he felt unanchored, torn between rebellion and responsibility. A friend urged him to apply to College of the Holy Cross in Massachusetts, a Catholic school that promised a second chance. Clarence arrived in 1968 carrying little more than a suitcase and a growing skepticism about institutions. At Holy Cross, he studied hard. He joined the Black Student Union, debated philosophy late into the night, and marched for equality. But he also began to see that rage left unchecked, consumes the soul. He remembered that his grandmother would pray frequently, and her prayers and the discipline of those nuns, they were affecting how faith and reason were never meant to be enemies in his mind. Slowly, the embers of belief began to glow again. He read Thomas Aquinas and Frederick Douglass side by side. One teaching divine order, the other dignity of freedom. In that pairing, he found balance. One evening, gazing out over the campus lawn after a storm, he whispered a quiet prayer. Lord, if I can't change the world through the pulpit, show me another way. The answer would not come in church robes, but in the courtroom. By 1971, Clarence Thomas graduated with honors from Holy Cross, disciplined, sharpened, and renewed. He carried scars of delusionment, but also an unshakable conviction that perseverance must outlast pain. Faith had been tested, but not lost. And as Scripture says in James 1:12, blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because in having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life. Clarence would soon chase a new calling, law, because the fight for justice needed more than marches. It needed men who knew both suffering and grace. The priesthood had slipped away, but purpose had not. God simply changed the battlefield. In 1971, the young man from Pinpoint arrived in Yale Law School, a world away from the humid air of Georgia and the discipline of his grandfather's house. The halls of Yale were polished and powerful. Professors spoke the language of privilege, and classmates carried the quiet confidence of legacy. Clarence Thomas carried something else, a relentless drive and a silent question. Would merit ever matter more than color? At Yale, affirmative action had just opened doors for black students, but prejudice lingered in whispers. He felt the weight of suspicion that his place was there only because of charity, not because of achievement. Clarence worked twice as hard, read twice as long, and left with a degree, yet not with peace. Later he said, I graduated from Yale with a law degree that carried a 15-cent price tag, the cost of a sticker I put on it because it felt worthless. That pain became fuel, though. After law school, Clarence accepted a position as Assistant Attorney General in Missouri under John Danforth, a man who would become both mentor and friend. It was humble work handling small criminal cases, but it honed his precision and discipline. When Danforth entered the U.S. Senate, Thomas followed him to Washington, serving as a legislative aide. There in the capital of power and politics, he found himself walking a tightrope, too conservative for some, too independent for others. He believed in personal responsibility and the dignity of work. He distrusted bureaucracies that replaced discipline with dependency. His beliefs were forged not in theory, but in sweat, scripture, and struggle. As the years passed, Clarence Thomas's resume grew. He served as a lawyer in a private practice, then joined the Department of Education, and later the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, where he became the chairman in 1982. There, he confronted the realities of workplace discrimination, but also the moral complexities of a nation divided by ideology. Some accused him of betraying his race for his politics. Others accused him of being too rigid, too moral, and too devout. He once said, "The worst thing you can do to a man is make him doubt his own worth. I've spent my life proving mine to no one but God." During this time, he began re-examining the faith that had carried him from childhood to crisis. He attended Mass again, prayed daily, and found strength in Scripture. The boy who once knelt on the altar now knelt beside his bed. Older, wiser, and still seeking grace. His journey was not without loneliness. Public life brought scrutiny. Private life brought scars. But through every trial, the words of Romans 5:3-4 became his anchor. We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. That endurance soon carried him into the next chapter, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. And by 1989, his intellect, composure, and unshakable convictions caught the attention of those who valued quiet strength over loud ideology. 2 years later, President George H.W. Bush nominated Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court of the United States, one of the most powerful and scrutinized positions in American life. For the boy who once shoveled coal at dawn and prayed in a one-room chapel, it seemed impossible. Yet, as his grandfather once told him, do what you're called to do and leave the rest to God. The race was nearing its most brutal stretch. The nomination would test not his intellect or politics, but his faith, his dignity, and his very soul. The furnace was about to blaze, and in it, Clarence Thomas would discover whether a man refined by fire can truly stand when the heat comes for him. By the fall of 1991, the confirmation hearings for Clarence Thomas had become a national storm. Television cameras filled the Senate chambers. Headlines shouted accusations. Commentators speculated. Politicians postured. And a man once new for silence was now forced to defend not his record, but his reputation. Clarence sat before a committee of senators, calm, unflinching, composed. As hours of questioning turned into days, his face was resolute, his eyes fixed, his voice steady. In one moment of unshakable resolve, he called the ordeal a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks who in any way dare to think for themselves. The words cut through the noise like thunder. That moment crystallized what his life had always been. A refusal to be defined by others' expectations. A man choosing conviction over comfort. When the hearings then ended, and the Senate confirmed him by a razor-thin margin, Clarence Thomas became the 106th Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He was only 43. He had scaled the highest mountain of American law, yet his expression that day was not triumph but humility. He later said quietly, "All I ever asked of life was a fair chance and a freedom to finish my race." Through the decades that followed, Justice Thomas has become known for his restraint. The justice who seldom spoke during oral arguments, yet wrote opinions of conviction and moral clarity. He stood firmly for the Constitution's original meaning and for the belief that rights come from God, not from government. Critics, even today, call him stubborn. Admirers call him steadfast. He calls himself blessed. Outside the court, Clarence lives simply, visits students, mentors young lawyers, teaches the perseverance in the greatest education. He returns often to the South, to the dusty roads of Georgia, where he tells children, your race, your poverty, your past, none of that can stop you if you don't quit. Don't you ever quit. Clarence has never forgot his faith, how it has sustained him, nor the Catholic nuns who taught him discipline, or his grandfather who taught work. He relies on the scriptures that teach him endurance. Clarence sees that every step of his life, from Pinpoint to Washington, has been part of a divine race, one that began with hardship and continues in purpose. There's a passage in 2 Timothy 4:7 that encapsulates Clarence's life. I fought the good fight. I've finished the race. Though not completely finished, but as one of the seniors on the Supreme Court, Clarence's days will be drawing to an end on the court, but he has kept the faith, and he is expected to finish strong as one of the most influential justices to ever serve on the highest court of the land. It's not a story of a perfect man, but of a persevering one. Though Clarence has been refined from fire from the beginning of his time at college, he has continued to be strengthened by his faith and sustained by grace. Clarence once told a group of lost graduates, if you allow bitterness to rule your heart, you will become a prisoner of your past. But if you let faith lead you, you will become a witness of what's possible. Clarence Thomas's journey reminds us that perseverance is not about outrunning others. It's about refusing to stop when the road turns uphill. It's about carrying your cross and continuing forward, even when no one else believes you can. You've been listening to Finish the Race, Stories of Perseverance and Triumph. Real people, real struggles, unstoppable faith. If today's story has inspired you, share it with someone who needs encouragement. Subscribe and visit finishtherace.com for devotionals, resources, and more stories of men and women who refuse to quit. Until next time, keep the faith, fight the good fight, and remember, with Christ as your strength, you too can run your race well until you finish your race. Take care.